Oh, good. Good. Excellent.
All right. So Carl, do you know Dennis McLoughlin? He's chair of the Handley Board of Trustees.
Hi, Carl.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I know of you.
I have a question right off for you. You know, when R. Gray Williams, your predecessor, was in charge, he was called the president of the Board of Trustees.
Right.
Whereas you are the chair.
Actually, I'm the president.
Okay.
Yes. That's a misstatement if it's shown as chairman.
I may have done that just now.
I am, you are absolutely correct. R. Gray Williams, in fact, R. Gray Williams, I never met him, but my former law partners were partners with him, and for years, our library had all these books with R. Gray Williams' name in it.
Wow.
So,
Really?
yes.
Yeah. Well, he was a monumental. Yeah, he was a monumental figure, huh? Right.
He was. I'm just a Johnny come lately in the scheme of things. You know, those R. Gray Williams, Holmes Conrad, they were formidable individuals.
Yeah. Yeah. I've often wondered, their lives did overlap. I wonder if R. Gray Williams ever met Judge Handley.
That's a good question. I don't know. He certainly got involved deeply after he died. But,
Right. So I just checked on the dates. Well, Williams was 27 years old when the judge died. So I mean, it's conceivable that they crossed paths.
yes, it is. Yes, it absolutely is.
Yeah.
Good question.
Right. Let's see. So I think I'll go ahead and start.
I think
And,
go in.
yeah. And will you keep an eye on, and will, if you see that admit, will you hop up there and
Sure.
let them in? Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and get started, and I am recording this. So I think chances are good that this will get more exposure through our website when it's posted there. I just wanted you to be aware that it is being recorded in some way. I'm assuming it's the video as well as audio. So thanks for coming. Thanks for joining through this format. We have a lot of things coming up with the Handley 100th celebration, and very busy through the next few months, including a presentation by one of our participants. Carl is going to talk about Handley's architecture, the school's architecture, and specifically its architect, Mr. McCornack, of a disciple of Thomas Jeffersonian architecture. That'll be on March 3rd at the school in the Patsy Cline Theater. And in conjunction with that, we're going to have an exhibit of Handley as portrayed in art and photography. So that's 6 weeks from now. Before that, we will celebrate Judge Handley's birthday on January 28th. His birthday is actually the 27th, but we'll be up at the school for that celebration, a dramatization, and then a birthday cake reception. We have a number of things in the month of February that are related to Black History Month, and including an exhibit, a special athletic event recognizing the Douglas Bulldogs. That'll be on February 2nd at the school that the athletic department's planning. And a number of other things that the best way to keep up with those events is to check our website frequently, which is onehandley.com, and also to check the listings in the Winchester Star. So let me ask you all, are you hearing me okay? You can just wave to me. Okay. All right. Very good. I do want to take a second and thank the Handley Regional Library for allowing us the facilities, their Benham room where we are now, and their mega computer. And then when we have the live sessions, we're over in the Armstrong Auditorium next door. They've been really generous with the facilities here, especially with our alumni speaker series events. Okay, so, and I'll point out that Dennis McLoughlin is here. He's the president of the Handley Board of Trustees and an attorney here in town. And he's going to lead next week's session, which is in person. And then the following week will be the Zoom session, concentrating on Judge Handley's will and the formation and role of the Handley Board of Trustees. So this is the book, obviously, that we are talking about, written by Dr. Garland Quarles, who was a longtime faculty member and principal and superintendent of schools. And then after he retired, he set about to learn more about this man for whom the school was named and who was its benefactor. And so he made that one of his first retirement activities. And I learned last week that it was actually a gift to him from, I'm not sure if it was from the school system itself or from fellow faculty members, but they actually gave him as a gift his trip to Ireland, where he went to do research about Judge Handley's early life, he and his wife. So the book was written in 1969. It was first published by the Farmers and Merchants Bank here in town. And then the second edition was published by the Winchester Frederick County Historical Society. And they did a few modifications, and then the book, they've been selling the book, making it available to the public. I'll also take this second to point out just a couple other books that are available through the Historical Society that might be of interest to people who are interested in the John Handley story. This is the Historical Society's journal, which is published annually. This volume comes from 2003, and it has a lengthy article written by an academic who was a graduate of Handley. And this, it's Kenneth Rose, and very good articles going more into the progressive education model that was adopted by R. Gray Williams, whom we were just discussing before the session got started, but really good follow-up to the Quarles book. And then also the Historical Society has this book, The History of Douglas School in Winchester, which was published a few years ago. It's a nice publication and appropriate too, because of course the Douglas School was also one of the institutions that was built with Judge Handley's bequest for the education of Winchester's Black students. And that was in, it served that purpose through 1966, at which time full integration was achieved, and those students then came to Handley or to whatever school system they were part of. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll do quite a bit of the talking tonight, but if anybody has comments at any point, just indicate to me and I'll be happy to hear from you. And then there are a few points where I'm going to try to encourage some conversation. So we'll start with, at the beginning, Judge Handley's birth in Ireland in 1835. We don't know a lot about his early years. As I mentioned, Dr. Quarles went to County Wexford to try to learn more about Judge Handley, but records were difficult, and but he did come away with two things that he was pretty clear had an impact on Handley's life from the early days. And anybody want to chime in on what those might have been? The potato blight, of course, at that time in Ireland, 1846 to 1851. Handley's father died in 1847 as a result of that famine. His 2-year-old sister died as well. And certainly it was what led Handley, as well as many, many other people, to immigrate away from Ireland. Handley did that himself in 1850 at age 15, coming to Canada, a 5-week journey on a ship, very difficult journey. And he didn't write about it, but other people who did, from their words, Quarles was able to learn about the conditions and that the illness that resulted from that famine followed them on the ship, and many people did not survive the trip. The other thing that Dr. Quarles seems to point out that was important for in Handley's development at the time was educational opportunities that did not exist for people such as himself. Irish Catholics were prohibited by the English crown from receiving formal education. As a result of that, there were educational facilities held in secret, and he obviously, based on the fact that he later became quite well self-educated, he made the best of that he could of those early days in Ireland. So, and I also wanted to point out, this is just an aside for later, but in that same year that Handley came from Ireland to Canada, a man named James Jeffkins emigrated from England to the United States. He was 54 years old, so he was a generation older than John Handley, but he had 2 sons, Thomas and James Jr., who were contemporaries of Handley, and that becomes part of the picture a little bit down the road. But I thought it was interesting that they both immigrated in the same year. So Judge Handley, I am calling him Judge Handley just out of habit. That's the way I grew up, calling him always Judge Handley. But of course, at this time, he was just a 21-year-old when he came to Rochester, New York, where he was naturalized in 1856. And immediately he was interested in the law, he was interested in politics, and he found himself being able to join the federal government in Washington, D.C. with different administrations. So in 1857, this is where Judge Handley was, John Handley at the time. He did then go on to study law on his own and was admitted to the DC bar in 1860 at age 25. A few years prior to that, we learned from Dr. Quarles' book that he met a woman who had been married before, who was named Catherine Thayer. She was a bit older than John Handley, wealthy, had a 12-year-old son who was mentally disabled, and they married, and then in 1960 moved to Scranton, Pennsylvania. Dr. Quarles raises the question, why Scranton? What caused him to move there when he left the DC area? He speculates that it might have been as a result of Scranton being a boom town at the time, very ripe for someone who was interested in getting into business as well as law. And but probably even more so, indications are that Handley had some relatives in the Scranton area. And that was probably what drew him there. So moved to Scranton in 1860, and then 1861, of course, the Civil War breaks out, and Handley volunteers as a 90-day volunteer for the Union forces, Union Army, at age 26. It was obvious in the Quarles book that Quarles was surprised by that, surprised to learn that when he was researching, because it's not something that Handley had ever talked about, that Quarles was aware of. He didn't find it in any writings or newspaper clippings, but he did find conclusive evidence that Handley had served for 90 days in the Union Army. And one interesting point that Quarles raised is that during those 90 days, Handley's service would have, with the company that he was with, would have brought him within 13 miles of Winchester, which later, of course, played such a big role in his life. That was at the Battle of Bunker Hill, although we don't believe that Handley himself saw combat. So this is one of the paradoxes that Dr. Quarles raises, the fact that in later years, it was pretty widely believed that Handley himself had Confederate sympathies, and yet he was a former Army not officer, but military person with the Union forces. So, I mean, what is it that makes us feel, based on Quarles' book, that that Handley did have more Confederate sentiments? Any thoughts on that?
Oh boy, that's very, very tough to figure out, isn't it? Huh?
Yeah. One of the things that's mentioned in the book from a visitor to Handley's home, much later, and this, of course, would have been a home in Pennsylvania, his apartment in the bank building, is that he had two very large portraits in his drawing room of General Lee and Stonewall Jackson. And in fact, the person who pointed this out last week pointed out that you had to actually bend down to get into the room, and then you looked up. You looked up at these images, almost as if they were, being honored in the way that he had it situated in his room. And then, of course, he also, and this is pretty well documented, that when he died, and I'm sorry, when he went to Mount Hebron, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but to get to buy the plot at which he was going to be buried, he first requested a plot in the Stonewall Cemetery within Mount Hebron, and was told that that was reserved for Confederate soldiers, and he was not eligible for that. So he asked to be buried as close in proximity as he could be, and in fact was. So his plot there is very close to the monument to the Confederate soldiers and the that part of Mount Hebron. So there were a number of things that indicate that that's where his loyalties lie, at least at that time of his life. I think there's a good reason to think that the people that he met, including probably in particular Holmes Conrad, who was a major in the Confederate forces, had a good bit of influence on Handley. Those two became business partners. Conrad, of course, was the first chair of the Handley Board of Trustees after John Handley died. But he probably had a lot of impact on Judge Handley and how he felt about things at the time. Larry, you had an interesting point before we started about this. Do you want to raise that point?
Well, I had raised the point as to whether the fact that the judge was originally from the North, made his money and his bequest to the city uncomfortable to some who might be conflicted by the fact that, the money that was helping to make the town what it would become was coming from the North. But of course, as Dennis, pointed out, and as you alluded to earlier, he clearly had some attachment to Winchester, and that probably wasn't much of a factor.
Interesting point, though. All right, so after Handley's military service, he went back to Scranton. He resumed his law practice, and he then became counsel to the draft board. And Dr. Quarles points out that draft board was much despised by many people within the Lackawanna County community. And the reason for that, of course, was that it was possible to buy your way out of the draft with the payment of $300. And so obviously the poor people, the coal miners, the steel workers of the area were not going to be able to do that. And so there was a great injustice with that scheme for how people could buy their way out of service. And Handley was counsel to that board, and that might not have endeared him to some people in the community. Nevertheless, from 1861 to 1874 was a period of great wealth accumulation for John Handley. He made his money in real estate, both in sales and in rentals. He was involved in organizing, according to his records, at least 4 banks. Dr. Quarles was able to account for 2 of those. And that's where a lot of his fortune came during that period after his Civil War service and up until 1874, 1875. During that time, he also separated from his wife quietly, Dr. Quarles says, and then divorced from her in 1873. She remarried, and then she died about 4 years before he did. So one of the great paradoxes is, how was it that Handley, who was a young, uneducated, penniless Irish immigrant in 1854, was all of a sudden a very wealthy man a mere 16 years later after arriving in the US? So a fairly short period of time saw him become quite wealthy after basically starting with nothing. And so theories for that, I'll pause for a second, see if anybody's got any before I offer some that I have on my list here. Anybody?
Well, I would just express the thought that though he may have arrived penniless from Ireland, that he must have gotten a very, very sound education in Ireland. He may have come penniless, but he didn't come without good brains. And I think a good education from Ireland.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it was a formal education, certainly, because of the civil penalties against Catholic lads at the time. But obviously, you're correct that he had a lot of brains and a lot of initiative, and was and put that to work when he did get here, whether he had much formal training or not. I thought it was interesting. Quarles talked about in Ireland what were known as hedge schools, and those were schools where communities would hire a school teacher who would educate their sons who were not able to be educated formally because of the British Crown, and they would go out into the fields and have classes behind hedges so that they wouldn't be discerned. And that's where the name hedge school came from. But so he did get that type of education and obviously made as much out of it as he could. All right, Larry, did you have?
Say to that.
Yeah.
Also, I think he married well. So he had the financial backing of his wife, arguably. I mean, there's no factual proof of that, but I would offer that up. I also think he was fiscally conservative or thrifty with whatever money he had. And as you pointed out, Carl, he was intelligent and made very good investments in real estate and in banking. So in the 16 years from when he, took off at 19, he did very well for himself.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I was going to add was just that, being in the legal profession, that probably gave him access to, people who were trying to get things done with their own capital, who were more than willing to also, give him an opportunity, invest and be part of whatever venture that they were working on. And no doubt, like most people of that time, he was probably very, street smart and wise, in addition to no doubt being very hardworking and entrepreneurial in spirit.
Right. That's a good point about the contacts that he had and the accessibility that he would have had as a result of his position as a lawyer and as a judge.
So Dennis, Dennis, do you suppose that he would have read with some other lawyer in DC before he took the DC bar exam?
I suspect he did, although I don't think there's any actual reference to that. The reading of the law is so rarely done anymore, but certainly there have been lawyers over the years in Winchester, that judges that read the law, and under someone's tutelage. So I think you're right, Carl. He probably did.
It'd be fun for you, Dennis, to have a look at the DC bar exam as it was in 1860.
See if you could pass it.
What do you suppose that bar exam was like?
Interesting. Yeah, another point, based on what Larry just said, that we really didn't talk about too much at last week's session in terms of conditions that were made it ripe for Judge Handley to become wealthy, was the fact that Scranton was quite a boom town at that time in both real estate and banking, but also the coal industry there was, was raising property values and business satellite businesses that that Handley took advantage of. And then there's one more that's a little bit more nefarious, I guess, is a reason that is sometimes given as perhaps a way that he acquired some of his wealth. And that was that in his position as counsel for this draft board, did he receive any of the funds that that people who were able to pay to avoid military service paid. So those are quite a few good examples of what probably accounted for Handley's growth in wealth during that time. So as he was doing business in Scranton area, he also became acquainted with Winchester. This was as a result of his friendship in Scranton with the Jifkins family. I mentioned the two sons, James Jr. and Thomas. Handley began coming to Winchester to visit, particularly, I think it was Thomas, but it could have been James Jr. One of them was the owner of a property just outside of Winchester called Woodville that had quite an interesting history, and was actually still in existence until not too long ago. It fell into really bad repair and was razed, but that was the Woodville property. And we know from Quarles's book that Handley came to Winchester, visited the Jifkins family, stayed in their home. And then from that, those visits, he also met a lot of other people in Winchester, including a lot of people who had business connections, people involved in the law, and people who were interested in going into business with John Handley, and including among them Holmes Conrad. We have indications that Handley stayed in at the Conrad House, which was a pretty famous house on Braddock Street that was torn down a few decades ago. And also stayed in your law office, Dennis.
Actually, not to correct it, but I think his house was on Cameron Street, not on Braddock. It was where the parking lot is for the Joint Judicial Center.
Right.
Now.
Right.
Is where it's out.
Yes. Yeah, I misspoke, but that's exactly right. And that was the instance that actually gave rise to the local preservation of historic Winchester. That set of circumstances that led to the demolition of that building.
And actually, when that was taking place, Henry Whiting, who was a lawyer from Winchester, went out to become a Supreme Court justice, salvaged the front door to the house of Holmes Conrad's house. He had it fixed up, and it's famous. It's a pink door that if you come into the Joint Judicial Center and you look up the third floor, it's the door into the judge's chambers. That was from Holmes Conrad's house.
That's right. I had forgotten that. I'm glad you reminded me of that. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay. That's all right. That's interesting. So In 1874, a judgeship became available in Pennsylvania, and Judge Handley threw his hat into the ring to run for the position and won. His election to that position was even noted in the Winchester Times, which was the newspaper here then. So he was already pretty well known locally. The paper took note of his winning of this election, and he happened to point out in a letter to his brother, and this is on page 8, I think, of the book, that his portrait was hanging after his election in the courthouse. And I told the group last week, and I'll send you all the picture as well, but when my husband and I went on vacation this summer, we were going through northwestern Pennsylvania on our way to New York. And when I saw that we were heading through Scranton, I insisted that we stop, and we went to the courthouse there and met a lawyer who was coming in at the same time that we were, and he took us around to the various courtrooms until we found that portrait. And it's still hanging. We'll talk about that in a little bit later, but we've got some interesting pictures of both the courthouse and the portrait and the church where Handley's Scranton funeral took place. So he was on the bench for only 10 years. In 1884, it was time for him to run for re-election, and the Democratic Party that he was part of put up a different candidate. He ran as an independent Democrat, and the two Democrats split the vote, and the Republican won the office. So he was really disappointed with that and withdrew from somewhat from social activities in Scranton, became a bit more focused on his Winchester connections and his Winchester business. He also, at this time, which would have been 1886 until his death in 1895, began to write in his letters that he was experiencing some illness. There's not a lot of detail as to what that was, but he just wasn't enjoying good health in the last 10, even 15 years of his life, even though he was a reasonably young man. By my standards, he was quite young, right? 50 to 60. So he was focused then on business in Winchester, his interactions with his friend, Major Holmes Conrad. Handley expressed to Conrad his desire to, quote, promote the happiness and welfare of the people of Winchester. That was in 1888. And his initial inclination was to establish a park in Winchester. Mr. Conrad suggested that something that was more involving of job creation, and tourism, such as a hotel or resort in the community, would be more helpful than a park. So the two of them, with some other colleagues, established in 1889 the Equity Improvement Company. And that company was then incorporated in the state of Virginia in 1890, and Handley became the president. Conrad was also an officer. They issued stock. They had a very ambitious plan and planned to open 11 different enterprises. These are listed on page 44 of the book, which included a hotel, but also a brickyard, a sawmill, an ice company, a canning company, an opera house, a ladies' underwear company, tobacco factory, a water company. So big plans to do a lot in the city of Winchester. They issued $1 million worth of stock. And initially investors were excited and purchased stock, but that was a big undertaking for a community like this, which had was still recovering from the war and had been pretty much decimated by the Civil War. So by the time, I mean, after the initial issuance of that stock, there were not many subscribers. And Quarles's quote is that Handley misjudged the capacity of Winchester to subscribe to $1 million in stock. This was not the booming Scranton that he was used to. So also about this time, and we had a little bit of preliminary talk about this too, but there was that interesting story from Quarles's book about the dispute that Handley had with the city of Scranton over an assessment in for roads in that area where his hotel. Now he was the owner of the Wyoming Hotel, which was described in the book as the most elaborate hotel in the state of Pennsylvania. So here's this hotel, and the city had just not too long before issued an assessment to cobblestone the street where the hotel's located. And Handley, as well as the other property owners, had participated in that. And then not long after, the city came along, according to Quarles's book, and issued another assessment for asphalting of the street. And Handley was very unhappy about that and resisted it. And the story is, and there's some indication it was a little bit facetious, but I think that the city council did in fact do this. They issued an ordinance that well, they went ahead and did asphalt on all the other properties except for the property right in front of Handley's hotel because of his objection to paying for it. So the other parts of the street are asphalted. And then they issue an ordinance that that any part of the street that is not asphalted is appropriate then for a haymarket where livestock can be brought in. And so here Handley's big fancy hotel all of a sudden has become a livestock market right in front of his hotel as a result of this dispute with the city. And so, you know, there's some speculation that he wasn't very enamored of the city of Scranton at the end of his life. That's one interesting little anecdote that maybe comes into play a bit. Also, there is indication that Handley was quite disappointed with his loss in the judgeship election, 10, 15 years before. So he, in addition to buying the property where the hotel was to be built, and was actually built, but never was fully, never took off and ended up being torn down just a few years later. In addition to that property, the equity company, which Handley had founded with Holmes Conrad, bought 72 acres along Valley Pike in Winchester, that later became the site of Handley High School. So that was, but it took a kind of a circuitous route get there. So Handley's company bought this property. And then after Handley's death, the company went defunct, and the company ended up selling that property to the Handley Board of Trustees, which by that time had become formed and was tasked with administering the bequest of Judge Handley's will. So, and ultimately, the Handley Board of Trustees, in conjunction with the city school board, decided that that would be the site of the new high school, the new school, actually grades 4 through 12. So let's back up a little bit. In 1889, Handley bought his cemetery plot in Mount Hebron. So even 5-6 years before his death, he had decided that this is where he was going to be buried. As I indicated before, he wanted it to be close to the Stonewall Cemetery within the cemetery proper, so that he would be close to the Confederate soldiers. His plot was equal to 10 plots. So he basically bought 10 plots to make up his. And then he made his will in 1890. So that was about 5 years before he died. And did not speak about the terms of his will. It was not known until after his death what he had decided to do with his wealth. All right. So he died then on February 15th, 1895 at age 60. The book on page 62 talks about his physical characteristics. I think Quarles includes it here at the end of his life because of his large stature. It required a special coffin for him. He was 6'6" tall and a large man, 250, 260 pounds. And so it required an especially made coffin, and it required extra pallbearers to carry it. The book also then, at the end of his life, talks about all the post-death tributes that came in, both in the newspapers in Scranton and also in Winchester. So any comments about what those would be or what those were? I mean, there's a lot of tributes about both his qualities as a judge, as a jurist. He was stated as being very fair and a reasoned man. People generally were accepting of what his decisions were from the bench. And so a lot of attorneys and townspeople spoke very highly about his service, even though he wasn't reelected when he ran.
A couple of things came to my mind, and not directly related to what you just said, but one of them is those people in Scranton played hardball. I mean, considering its times, to say, all right, well, you're going to be this way. We're going to put livestock sales in front of your hotel. That's not messing around.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a pretty impressive move on their part for sure.
Yeah, at least the city leaders did. I mean, I think Handley was favored more by the townspeople and by there's also an indication from the tributes and from what we learned from his will later, that he was quite generous, and he left, even though he didn't leave any funds to Scranton itself, he left funds to some of its institutions, especially of learning or institutions, orphanages, Catholic institutions, and he was extremely generous in supporting the education of students. He would house them in his home. They would have rooms within a rooming house type environment, and he would pay for their schooling. And one of the terms of his will was that any of the students who were in school now, as a result of, at the time of his death, as a result of his gifts to them, he instructed that they be allowed to continue in school. And so people knew of his generosity, and that came out in these tributes as well.
The other thing that struck me is after, and I, know a couple folks who are on the board over at Mount Hebron, is, in that day and age, to sell 10 cemetery plots, to one person at one time would have been so unheard of, I'm sure, that no doubt that was a godsend to that cemetery at that time.
That's interesting. Yeah. And the other thing about the his resting place there, not only is it a very large plot because of the accumulation of multiple lots, but also the monument itself. There's evidence that he actually designed it, and that it was manufactured by a company in New England and came to and brought down to Winchester after a year after he died, but it took four railway cars to bring it. It was 72 tons, and at that time in 1896 dollars, it was valued at over $8,000. So my husband did the calculations at last week's session. I think he said it was, like in today's terms, $300,000 or $400,000. I think is the figure that he came up with. So it's quite an elaborate burial place. And also, let's talk about his funeral. So he was his first funeral was in Scranton at the St. Luke's Church, which is pictured in the book. And then I have pictures of that from our trip there this summer. But it was said from the newspaper clippings that it was the largest funeral that Scranton had ever seen up to that time. And then same thing can be said with his funeral in Winchester. So after his funeral there, his body was taken to the rail line and had a day-long journey to arrive here at the railway station on Piccadilly Street. And then the funeral was the next day. His body laid at the Christ Episcopal Church for overnight, and then the service was the next morning there, and that it was so large that many people were lining the street because they could not get in. But and this was before the will terms were known, so he obviously had a lot of friends, and a lot of people knew of him, and knew that he had tried to bring about some good things within the city during his lifetime. Many of which, unfortunately, did not succeed. So he had the funeral at the church, and then burial at Mount Hebron, where also the Quarles book talks about that being a huge gathering of people, one of the biggest outpourings that the city had seen. Those schools were closed, the bells tolled, city offices were all closed on the day of his funeral. And then his last will was read. And in that, there were two terms of his will, and Dennis will talk a lot more about this next week and the week after, but the two terms that were of particular interest to Winchester folk were in what was the fourth article, where it was instructed that there be construction of a public library within Winchester to be named the Handley Library. And then secondly, the residuary clause, which left all the rest and residue of his estate for, quote, the creation of schoolhouses for the education of the poor. And that sum comes to, if you add up what was the residuary after the 20 years of accumulation of that estate, came to $1.6 million. So quite a huge sum of money for that time. We wouldn't even turn that down now at the Education Foundation, right, Larry? You'll take that. All right.
So that entire 1.6 million went to Handley then.
Went to Winchester for the creation of schoolhouses. So it didn't all end up at Handley High School construction. There were some other projects, and then some of the funds, remained and will be the subject of discussions next week. But yeah, that was. There were other school projects, including the Douglas School, the property where Virginia Avenue is, and so on. So we'll get into that more next week.
Okay, good.
But let's talk about really what is probably the biggest paradox, and this is the question that everybody has. And I said last week, when I was at Handley in the 70s, we had a cheer that went Handley, 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 Handley High. And I like to think about that cheer with the Handley, and instead of a letter Y, to turn that into the question why, WHY. Why did this man leave much of his fortune, the bulk of his fortune, to the city of Winchester, where he had never lived, while pretty much ignoring his hometown of Scranton, Pennsylvania? And a number of theories on that. There are no definitive answers, but we've already touched on some of them. But anybody care to offer anything on that?
Oh boy. The only thing I can say is that as an historian, I haven't done any research on Judge Handley, but as an historian, I have this feeling that there must be sources in archives somewhere that would tell us a little bit more about this man than we seem to know. I mean, when all is said and done, we really haven't touched the heart of this man at all, have we?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that Dr. Quarles did a very good job with what was available to him. That's the impression I have. But that was quite a while ago, and he will admit in his book he admits quite readily that it was difficult to find much information about him. I don't know if other strategies would yield more information at this time.
Just in the way of wild speculation. I mean, is it
Mhm.
conceivable that he had a mistress in Winchester?
Well, I guess anything's conceivable. I've never heard that. And,
Really? I mean, that seems like an obvious possible solution to your paradox, doesn't it?
Well,
well, go ahead, Larry.
you know, what makes us think he was straight either? You know, the fact that he was married part of his life doesn't mean that he necessarily wasn't a closeted gay man. In Winchester, in fact, you know, the founding, you know, families were, you know, the Glass family. So, you know, there might have been some kinship that he felt with this entire community that we're not aware of. You know, and you've done a wonderful job, but as you know, as you just alluded to, you know, we don't really know much about the personality, you know, the words and the thoughts of the man. We know a lot of factual information about him, but, you know, we're now trying to, you know, speculate on his behavior without a whole lot of knowledge, although certainly animosity towards Scranton based on how he was treated could certainly cause one to think very kindly of a community where you were always received warmly. You know, from a visual standpoint, this is certainly a beautiful place, and he might have felt some empathy toward the fact that while Scranton was booming economically, Winchester was still struggling to rebuild itself from the war.
Right. Yeah, I think you touched on several things there. One is, I mean, whether he had intimate relations with anybody in Winchester or not, it certainly seems that he liked the people here overall and wanted to, you know, wanted to do well for them. And related to that, he seemed, I would speculate that he probably was disappointed in the failure of the equity company and the failure to realize the, you know, the ambitious plans that he and others had for the community. And so maybe he, and the fact that a lot of people lost their investment. You know, they did subscribe to his stock and it didn't pan out for them. And so maybe this was a way of trying to compensate for some of that.
A little bit of payback. The other thing, and we don't really have much of a sense of his personality, but clearly he was a large man. And, you know, to get people to subscribe to that kind of an investment, either here or certainly he did the same thing in Scranton in building up that wealth. We must be talking about one of those larger than life people, and we all know them, who walk into a room and own the place.
Yeah.
You know, whether through their words or just their physical presence, when they're there,
Right.
you know they're there. And clearly this man had some kind of magnetism of some sort, you know, if he's able to continue to, you know, get these people to invest and work with him.
Right.
Well, I think the other thing is, he was, I gather, like you said, his physical presence was larger than life. I don't necessarily get the feeling, though, that he was a charmer, very outgoing. In fact, the last so many years of his life, he was more of a recluse. But what he did do is make friends with people like Holmes Conrad, who, I'm not saying he did it with a mission, but if he was getting people to subscribe for the stock, it was really going to be partly based on, if not a lot based on, the fact that, well, if it's good enough for Holmes Conrad, it's good enough for me. So I think he made friends in the right places. And I think he genuinely liked the people of Winchester, is my thought. Yeah.
So Mr. Conrad sounds like quite an interesting man, you know, indeed, that it might be interesting to know a little bit more about at some point.
Right.
There's a whole thing in the book about him. He was He was a well-known attorney. He represented the Handley Board in a number of these different trials that we'll talk about next week. He also, I think, went on to become Attorney General.
I think so. Yeah, he was
Yeah.
in state politics.
Yes, and he was in state politics, so he was very well known.
Mhm.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to the next presentation.
So, so there's almost nothing in the way of personal correspondence left. Is that correct?
I think that's true. Very well, there's some that Dr. Quarles references, but not a lot, not a lot. I think he was hoping to uncover a lot more and encounter. Yeah. Another thing that is sometimes mentioned, and perhaps this plays into what was just discussed with the Holmes Conrad connection, was that was Handley enamored of this area because it was in the South, because of his Confederate sentiments, his respect for Lee and Jackson especially. Did that have any play? I mean, I personally would put that pretty far down the list, except to the extent that maybe his connection with and friendship with Conrad and maybe some other men who had been Confederate officers might have influenced him. I suspect that wasn't one of the overriding reasons why he decided to leave his wealth to Winchester.
Can I add one other thing?
Please.
Another thing is, at the time that Judge Handley wrote his will in 1890, there had just been a major gift made to the city of Scranton to build a library. So it was like, the seeds are planted. For various reasons, Scranton, I'm not their favorite son, and I think that was potentially the genesis for the money that was set aside for the creation of the Handley Library.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it
They
was
only got one in Scranton, and my second home or friendship is in Winchester. I'll do that for Winchester.
right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it was a time of philanthropy. There were a lot of wealthy families that were leaving funds to municipalities, and you know, Judge Handley perhaps wanted to be part of that. He also saw that in Winchester itself, just a few years before, John Kerr, who was a wealthy man, had left a bequest to the city of Winchester for the construction of a school here. So, you know, that's a good point, Dennis. So, you know, we've got 4 or 5 reasons there, maybe even 5 or 6, that could account for why this bequest was made. And then we'll kind of finish up with a discussion of what was it that we learned about Handley life, his personality, his characteristics from Dr. Quarles's book that might suggest why he decided to direct that those gifts to Winchester be used specifically for creation of a library and creation of schoolhouses for the education of the poor.
Well, I mean, my first, guess would be that given his own experience as a young child, not being able to access the kind of education that he might have longed for, gave him a lifelong appreciation for, and kind of he carried that wound and was looking to, make sure others didn't go through that same experience.
Both with schools for education of the poor, which he himself was in his youth, But also, as I think Becky Ebert pointed out at our last session, because he was self-taught, he probably had quite an appreciation for libraries and, you know, the use of public facilities like that to better oneself. And we also see in his history an appreciation for the role of education, in that he assisted many students with their academies and even colleges, their educational needs.
So he was baptized a Roman Catholic. Do we know anything about his separation from the Roman Catholic Church?
No, I don't know. I think that his wife was a member of that St. Luke's Church, which I gather is Episcopalian in Scranton, and then that makes sense with his. You know, Quarles's book doesn't say that he attended the Episcopalian Church here when he was here in town, but it did indicate that he asked to be to have his funeral there. So I don't know anything about his connections with or severance of connections with the Catholic Church. Don't know.
Gee, we just don't know much about the inner man, do we?
It sounds like it might be a project for you, Carl.
I was gonna say, I second that motion.
Yeah.
No.
Very
Don't know much
good.
about the inner man. Yeah.
So, let me look at my notes real quickly and see if there's anything else I wanted to cover just as a teaser for the next session. So we have these very large bequests. City Council probably wisely sought counsel as to how to handle this influx of funds, and they were advised by their attorneys that they really should not try to handle this themselves. And with that in mind, they petitioned the General Assembly to for the creation of the Handley Board of Trustees. And then the next 30-some years between the time of Handley's death and the time of the actual opening of Handley High School. Now, the library was about 10 years before that. But those 30 years full of a lot of litigation, a lot of difficult times, both for the executors in Pennsylvania and for the Board of Trustees here in Winchester. So that's kind of the teaser of what's to come, and we will hear more next week. Any other? Any other?
Next week, it will be Tuesday live here at Handley Auditorium at 6:30, and I think Kim has done an excellent job in summarizing the book, especially as concerns John Handley, the individual, John Handley, the lawyer. And next week, what I intend to do will be to talk about John Handley's will and the controversy surrounding it, and also the founding of the Handley Board of Trustees. And in fairness to people who might be there next week that weren't here able to hear Kim either last week or this week, I will also give a much shorter synopsis on Judge Handley, just as a lead-in to what we're going to talk about, because I know of a couple of people who were unable to come last week. If you remember, we had a deluge of rain. The water was over the curbs. So it was
snow this week.
knowing the party that we were out here last week.
That's right.
So I will also forewarn you all, if you tune in by Zoom 2 weeks from tonight, or if you come live next week, that some of what you heard tonight you will hear again, but in a more in a shorter version.
Right, yeah. Yeah,
So
I
that-
pointed out last week, this book that we're talking about is 109 pages, including photos and graphics and so
Right.
on. But Judge Handley dies on page 56. So there's a lot that happened after he died. And so that'll be the focus of next week and the week after.
Well, thank you very much for putting this presentation. It's very well done.
Well, that's great. Yeah, it was great, Kimberly. And so we're gonna see you all of us on Tuesday, right?
That's right.
Right.
You can,
Okay.
you can choose to come in person next week
Yep,
or
yep.
by Zoom again the following week.
Yeah. Or
All right.
both, or both.
Or both.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you. Great.
Thank you, Kimberly.
Thank you very much. All right. Have a nice evening.
Yeah, thank you.
See you all.
Good night. Good night, all.
Bye-bye. Let's see here.
Well done. Well, that was